Welcome to this trip through one of the most shocking cases in Pennsylvania's history. Before we start, please leave a comment letting me know where you are and what time it is when you listen to this narration. We want to know where and when these documented accounts happen. The sound of soft footsteps echoes through the empty halls of what used to be Ravenwood Asylum, which was in the remote woods of western Pennsylvania. This big Victorian building is a silent witness to a lot of stories that will never be told. County records from 1903 say that what happened inside these walls would change how people thought about mental health care in America forever, but not many people know the whole story. The official records say that Ravenwood was open from 1887 until it suddenly closed in 1904. They don't say why, though. Tonight, we look at a carefully documented case that was kept secret in Pennsylvania State Archives until 1961, when a routine transfer of old medical records showed something much worse than anyone could have imagined. In the fall of 1903, Dr. William Harrison, a well-known alienist from Philadelphia, came to Ravenwood to do a routine check. What he wrote down over the next 6 weeks would never be included in any official report. His personal journal, which was found in a sealed box during the 1962 demolition assessment of the East Wing, tells a different story. One of systematic cruelty disguised as treatment, of voices silenced, and of a medical establishment that chose to ignore it. This story doesn't have any ghosts or otherworldly events in it. The terror that filled Ravenwood came from people, and maybe that's what makes it so scary. Some people say that truth is stranger than fiction. In the case of Ravenwood Asylum, the truth was hidden, twisted, and buried on purpose. As we put together what really happened in the last months of 1903, keep in mind that everything you hear is based on written records, such as medical logs, administrative correspondence, patient records, staff testimonies, and Dr. Harrison's own notes. To protect the little dignity they were denied in life, the names of some patients have been changed. The darkness that fell over Ravenwood didn't come from the grave. It came from the minds of the people who were supposed to protect the most vulnerable people in society. That is probably the most terrifying truth of all. There are a lot of secrets in Westmoreland County. Ravenwood Asylum, which is about 17 miles from Pittsburgh, was built to be forgotten. It was built in a place where the screams wouldn't carry, so families could leave their troublesome relatives there and go back to society without any problems. The building is in a valley between two hills and is surrounded by thick oak and maple forests that turn blood red every fall. Topographical surveys from 1885 show that the site was chosen because it was so isolated. The nearest town, Millbrook, was 7 miles away along roads that weren't well maintained and became almost impassable during harsh Pennsylvania winters. The Westmoreland County Historical Society's employment records show that Ravenwood lost 37 employees in 1903 alone, a turnover that had never happened before and would go unexplained for decades. The resignation letters kept in administrative files give vague reasons for leaving, such as personal issues, health problems, and family responsibilities. However, local newspaper archives from nearby towns show an interesting pattern. None of these former workers stayed in the area. They spread out across the country, leaving no forwarding addresses and cutting all ties to their old jobs. It was a clear fall morning on the 18th of October 1903. The big wrought iron gates of Ravenwood Asylum opened for Dr. William Harrison's carriage. The Pennsylvania Medical Board had heard troubling things about the quality of care for patients, but nothing specific, just rumors and anonymous letters. They purposely hid their handwriting, which suggests that they did things that went against modern medical ethics and treated patients as subjects instead of people who needed care. Harrison was the best person to look into this because he was the state's top expert on modern psychiatric practices. He had the best credentials. He went to Johns Hopkins, wrote articles for well-known medical journals, and was known for his progressive views on how to treat mentally ill people with kindness. He wrote in his journal on the first day, "The facade is impressive. Grand architecture, suggesting healing and progress. Yet, something feels immediately wrong. The windows, though large, seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. The grounds are immaculately maintained, yet strangely devoid of patients enjoying the therapeutic benefits of fresh air, as modern treatment would dictate. The main building rose 4 stories and was made of dark granite quarried from nearby mountains. When it was built in the 1882, it was built in a style that was popular at the time, with pointed arches, steep gables, and decorative cornices. Harrison noted, however, that there were small differences between this building and others from the same time period. There were a lot of windows, but they were placed at odd angles that made it hard to see between wards. The hallways went in strange directions, making it hard to find your way around the building. The most interesting thing about the grounds was that there were high walls covered in ivy, not just around the property, but also between different parts of the complex. This made it so that there were courtyards that couldn't be seen from each other. Dr. Malcolm Thorne, Ravenwood's medical director since 1896, met Harrison. County Medical Society records say that Thorne was brilliant but harsh. He turned Ravenwood from a small asylum into a place where wealthy families from all over the Northeast sent their embarrassing relatives to get the best care possible. Thorne looked very different. He was tall and thin, with silver hair that was pulled back tightly from a high forehead. Harrison said his eyes were pale blue and very clear, but they also seemed empty, like looking through glass into nothing. He spoke in a soft voice that made people lean in a little to hear him. He moved with precise, economical gestures that made people unconsciously bow to him. "Thorne has a certain coldness," Harrison wrote that night. "His credentials are perfect. He went to Harvard Medical School and did research in Vienna and Paris, but his eyes give nothing away. He talks about patients with clinical detachment, calling them by their diagnosis instead of their name." When Harrison asked for full access to all wards, something flickered across Thorne's face, so briefly that Harrison almost missed it. Hesitation, calculation. He got better quickly and told Harrison that Ravenwood has nothing to hide. Harrison didn't know at the time that his regular inspection would find a system so disturbing that the state of Pennsylvania would keep the results secret until 1961. According to minutes from a closed board meeting in January 1904 that have since been made public, some information was thought to be harmful to public trust in medical institutions and upsetting to the families of former patients. The first tour showed a facility that looked like it had modern psychiatric care, clean wards, organized schedules, and what seemed to be a well-trained staff. Patients lived on the main floors in conditions that were institutional, but by the standards of the time they seemed humane. Harrison remarked on the quality of the bedding, the sufficient heating systems, and the spacious communal areas where patients could partake in simple crafts or read sanctioned materials. Harrison wrote in his journal that first night, "The patients are too quiet. In my experience, even well-run asylums have a certain energy, conversation, movement, and occasional outbursts. Here, there is a stillness that makes me uneasy." The patient's eyes follow staff movements with what I can only describe as resigned dread. Not one smiled or approached during our entire tour. This is not therapeutic calm. This is submission, born of something else entirely. Harrison also noticed that all of the patients looked well-groomed and healthy, which is unusual for a place that houses people with serious mental illnesses who often don't take care of themselves. "They look too much alike," he wrote. "It's as if they've been prepared for inspection. Their hair is cut to the same length, their posture is the same, and even their movements follow predictable patterns, like getting up from chairs at the same angle and walking at the same measured pace. It suggests conditioning rather than natural behavior." That night, as Harrison got comfortable in the guest room set aside for visiting doctors, he heard it for the first time. A rhythmic tapping coming through the pipes. This sound would become more and more familiar over the next few weeks. At first, he thought it was just the normal settling of an old building. Later, he would realize that it was something else entirely, a message. His room was in the administrative wing, which was separated from the patient wards by a long hallway and a number of locked doors. The furniture was nice. A carved oak bed, a writing desk in front of a window that looked out over the southern grounds, and a small fireplace with a coal grate for the colder autumn nights. It looked like a nice guest room for a gentleman in a nice home. But Harrison pointed out that the door locked from the outside, not the inside, and that the window, while big, was fixed shut with no clear way to open it for fresh air. Harrison started his official inspection the next morning by looking at patient records. The paperwork was very detailed. Maybe too detailed. There were regular entries for each patient that carefully described their treatments, behaviors, and progress. Harrison said, "There's an artificial quality to these records. Too neat, too consistent. Real patients don't progress in such orderly fashions. Real treatments don't yield such predictable results. These read more like demonstrations of treatment efficacy than genuine medical documentation." He asked for files on patients who had been discharged as cured in the past year. Thorne gave these without thinking twice. But Harrison noticed something strange. None of these former patients had gone back to their old lives. They had been moved to supervised living arrangements or convalescent homes in faraway states. None of them had gone back to work or rejoined their families. Being cured at Ravenwood seemed more like being moved than getting better. When he asked to talk to patients alone, his suspicions grew. Dr. Thorne disagreed, saying he was worried about messing up the therapeutic routines. Thorne reluctantly agreed after Harrison insisted, saying he had the authority from the state medical board. However, he assigned an orderly to stay with the doctor for his safety. Harrison said, "The patients speak as if they are reading from a script. When asked about their treatment, they all say the same thing. They praise Dr. Thorne's methods and thank him for their care. Their words say one thing, their eyes say another." One patient in particular caught Harrison's attention, a woman in her 30s who had been admitted for what the records called hysterical melancholia after the death of her husband. While the orderly was momentarily distracted during their short conversation, she leaned in a little closer to Harrison and whispered, "We're not all still here." When he asked her to explain, she went back to giving the same polite, empty answers as the others, denying that she had said anything at all. Harrison met Eleanor Sullivan, a nurse who had only been at Ravenwood for 3 months that afternoon. Harrison's journal says that she seemed nervous during their short conversation and didn't answer questions about patient care protocols directly. She was younger than most of the staff, maybe in her mid-20s, and Harrison said she had a look of haunted awareness that was very different from the practiced blankness of her co-workers. Sullivan slipped Harrison a folded note with hurried writing on it while Thorne was away dealing with something else. It said, "North Wing Basement, midnight. Come by yourself." That night, Harrison went over more records and found some worrying patterns. People often said that Ravenwood was a place where people could get better care, but patients rarely seemed to leave. Families got regular updates about small improvements that never led to full recovery. The death certificates were the most worrying part. An average of 3 patients died each month, all from natural causes or complications of mental illness. There were no autopsies done, and the bodies were quickly sent to a funeral home in Pittsburgh that was connected to Thorne's brother-in-law. The burial records showed another problem. A lot of patients were buried in a small cemetery on the asylum grounds, instead of being returned to family plots, even though they had living relatives who could have claimed the bodies. There wasn't an official tour that included the cemetery itself. When Harrison asked about it, Thorne brushed it off, saying that administrative staff take care of those kinds of things and that they should focus on the living patients who could benefit from modern treatments. Harrison walked toward the north wing as the grandfather clock in the main hall struck midnight. The way the building was set up was confusing, maybe on purpose. The narrow hallways branched off and turned back on themselves. Doors without signs led to places you didn't expect. A storage cabinet in a linen room that wasn't used very often hid the way to the basement. Harrison's descent down the stone steps made the air colder. The only light he had was from a small lamp he had brought from his room. The basement level was surprisingly large, much bigger than what the building above would have led you to believe. In some places, rough stone walls gave way to dirt corridors, which made it seem like some parts had been dug out long after the building was first built. Eleanor Sullivan was waiting, and she was shaking. "I'm not supposed to be here," she said quietly. "Someone has to speak, even though they watch all of us." That night, she told Harrison about a system of experimental treatments that were being done on certain patients, mostly those who didn't have family ties or powerful relatives. This would be the main focus of his private investigation. Sullivan said that these special protocols were done in a part of the basement that wasn't shown on any official building plans. Staff called it the laboratory. "Patients come back different," Sullivan told him. "Not improved, changed, compliant, empty. Doctor." Thorne calls it breaking the cycle of mental dysfunction, but he's breaking them as people. The screaming is terrible at first, then comes the silence. The silence is worse. Sullivan got the job after finishing nursing school in Philadelphia. When she got to Ravenwood, she thought the job would give her a chance to work at the cutting edge of psychiatric medicine. In just a few weeks, she knew something was very wrong. She talked about a strict hierarchy in which staff members were divided into groups, each with their own tasks and little knowledge of how the whole operation worked. Only a few people, handpicked by Thorne, were allowed to help with the special protocols. "He tests new staff," Sullivan said. "He gives them harder and harder tasks and watches how they react. Those who question are fired for being unfit, and those who comply move up." She had acted like she was following the rules while writing down what she saw, hoping to eventually get enough proof to tell the authorities. Sullivan gave Harrison a key that would let him into the restricted areas at night when there weren't many staff members around. She got it by making a wax copy of an original that she borrowed for a short time from a senior orderly who liked her. She held on to his arm with surprising strength before they said goodbye. She told him, "Be careful what you write in your official reports. Dr. Thorne has powerful friends in Harrisburg. Previous inspectors who raised concerns saw their careers suddenly end. One was even sent to an asylum in Maryland, where he was diagnosed with persecutory delusions." Harrison kept up his official inspection the next day, pretending to follow the usual procedures. He wrote in his journal, "I find myself putting on a show, asking expected questions, and making expected observations. At the same time, I'm keeping track of things that don't add up. Locked doors that aren't shown on floor plans. Staff who only work night shifts and are never seen during day tours. And patients whose records show regular treatments, but who I never see in any ward." He paid special attention to the pharmacy and medication storage, noting that while the official dispensary had standard treatments of the time bromides, chloral hydrate, and morphine sulfate, there was evidence of a separate pharmaceutical operation. The supply records showed that chemicals that aren't usually used in psychiatric treatment were bought, including compounds that are more common in experimental labs than in medical facilities. That night, Harrison went into the northern basement area with Sullivan's key. He wrote down what he found in a different journal that he kept hidden in his room, separate from his official notes. The 1962 building assessment found this journal, which gives the most complete picture of how Ravenwood really worked. There were surgical tables with restraints, cabinets of instruments, and detailed charts that tracked each patient's progress in the basement lab. The notebooks that Thorne used to keep track of his work were the most disturbing. Harrison would later write, "What Thorne calls curative therapy is nothing short of systematic torture disguised as medical treatment. He has developed techniques for breaking the human will, using combinations of sensory deprivation, painful stimuli, and chemical compounds of his own design." His notes speak of rehabilitating the defective mind by first reducing patients to a state of complete submission, then rebuilding them according to his vision of mental normalcy. Thorne referred to a process he called cognitive reconstruction in the lab journals. It started with what he called erasure, which was a vague mix of isolation, disorientation, and chemical sedation that could last for weeks. The patients were kept in the dark, subjected to random noise and silence, deprived of sleep, and given drugs that made them very suggestible. After being properly prepared, they entered the inscription phase, which involved systematic conditioning through rewards and punishments, as well as hypnotic suggestion and ongoing chemical management. Harrison found out that patients were chosen for these experimental protocols based on certain standards. People from wealthy families got standard care that didn't work, while people from lower social classes became unwitting test subjects. The patients labeled as permanent research subjects were the most troubling. Their conditions made them perfect for ongoing experiments with no plans to ever let them go. Thorne's notes showed that he was very interested in what he called memory architecture, which are ways to selectively remove or change certain memories while keeping others the same. One journal entry said, "Subject 38 no longer remembers her life as a school teacher, but she still knows everything she learned in school. When shown pictures of her old students, she doesn't recognize them. When shown academic materials from her old job, she shows complete competence." The selective erasure worked. Harrison found letters from well-known psychiatrists in the US and Europe among Thorne's papers. These were well-known names in the field who were interested in Thorne's methods and results. Some of them had even gone to Ravenwood to see these procedures in action. The horror of Ravenwood wasn't just the work of one crazy person. It was the logical result of a medical philosophy that saw some patients as less than human and as tools for progress instead of people who needed care. A ledger that kept track of financial deals with a number of pharmaceutical companies and medical equipment makers was probably the most disturbing thing. In exchange for detailed reports on how the compounds worked when tested on people, these groups gave Thorne experimental compounds and specialized equipment. The companies used fake names when they wrote to each other, but Harrison knew that several of them were major suppliers to hospitals in the Northeast. Harrison spent hours copying important papers and diagrams, trying to keep his cool as he realized how much work Thorne had done. He carefully put everything back in its place as dawn approached and then went back to his room. He wrote in his journal, "I have to be very careful. If I confront them directly, these records will probably be destroyed before any official action can be taken. I need proof that can't be denied, and witnesses who are willing to testify." Harrison came up with a careful plan over the next few days. During the day, he continued his official inspection, but at night, he secretly documented what Ravenwood was really like. He found possible allies among the staff, people who didn't like what the asylum was doing but didn't say anything because they were afraid. He drew detailed maps of the building, marking all the unofficial areas and ways to get in. Most importantly, he started to find patients who had been through Thorne's experimental treatments and write down their histories and conditions. Harrison was especially interested in one patient, a woman whose records only referred to her as Patient 47. Unlike other people who were part of Thorne's experiments and became passive and unresponsive, this woman stayed aware behind her compliant exterior. Harrison saw her tapping on tables, walls, and pipes in the same rhythmic pattern he had heard through the plumbing on his first night. He figured out it was Morse code after looking it up in a reference book. She kept spelling the same thing over and over. B-O-W. The official records for Patient 47 said she had a long-term case of delusional psychosis and was admitted in 1901. It was clear that her name was not real. It was Jane Smith. The intake paperwork was not as detailed as it was for other patients. It didn't include any family contacts or a history of previous illnesses. But Thorne's private research notes told a different story. At first, she worked as a nurse at another place and saw something she shouldn't have. The goal of her treatment at Ravenwood was not to cure her mental illness, but to erase certain memories while keeping her training and general cognitive functions intact. Harrison followed this lead on the night of October 29th, looking for ways to get to the basement lab from below. He found a narrow staircase behind a big storage cabinet that led to a sub-basement that wasn't on any building plans. The steps were worn smooth from use, despite their hidden location. There was a heavy iron door at the bottom that was locked with a complicated lock that Sullivan's key couldn't open. The next night, Harrison came back with tools he had borrowed from the maintenance shed. After almost an hour of careful work, the lock finally gave in. What he found there was worse than he could have imagined. A series of cells with patients in different stages of physical decline, some of whom looked like they had been locked up for months or even years. These were the failed experiments, the ones that didn't react as Thorne had hoped they would to his protocols but couldn't tell anyone else about what they had been through. Harrison's journal says, "The conditions are beyond inhumane. Patients are kept in spaces that are barely big enough to lie down in, with no proper sanitation or light. Some appear to have been subjected to crude surgical procedures, evidence of trepanation and other invasive techniques. The stench is overwhelming." How many inspectors have visited Ravenwood without discovering this hidden floor? Or did they discover it and choose to remain silent? The cells were set up in a circle around a central area that had examination tables and tools. Harrison counted 17 occupied cells, but some of the other cells were empty because the bedding looked like it had just been used. Some of the patients were in better shape than others. Some were able to follow his movements with their eyes, while others seemed to be in a catatonic state. Many had scars on their foreheads, skulls, or behind their ears that showed they had surgery. Some had marks on their wrists and ankles from being restrained, which suggests they had been in jail for a long time. Harrison spent the night writing down everything, measuring the cells, noting the conditions, and taking down identifying information from the few patients who could still talk. He wrote, "I recognize several names, patients officially recorded as having died from natural causes or been transferred to other facilities. These people have been erased from official existence, allowing Thorne to use them for ongoing experimentation without oversight or constraint." The most disturbing thing he found was a journal in the middle of the room that was not like the research notebooks upstairs. This had more personal thoughts on Thorne's work, written in a flowing script that was different from the official record's clinical notes. One entry said, "When the mind is properly unmade, it becomes like clay, able to be shaped in any way. We have been trying to get rid of mental illness with crude tools, like surgeons removing a tumor. The real progress is not in getting rid of dysfunction, but in rebuilding consciousness itself. The implications go far beyond treating the insane." Harrison noticed small changes in how the staff treated him the next morning during his official rounds. Orderlies followed at a distance. People stopped talking when he walked into a room. "Doctor." Thorne also said that Harrison might have gotten enough information and could end his inspection early. The most worrying thing was that Nurse Sullivan was missing. When Harrison asked where she was, he was told that she had to leave unexpectedly because of a family emergency. Harrison wrote that night, "They know, or at least suspect. Maybe I set off an alarm while I was exploring the sub-basement, or someone saw me using Sullivan's key. I've noticed that my things have been moved when I get back to my room. I need to speed up my timeline. I need to take all the documents I've collected with me when I leave, or they will disappear just like the patients below." Harrison put together all of his evidence that night into a full report that included floor plans, treatment records, patient names, and detailed descriptions of the experimental procedures. He put this paperwork inside the lining of his medical bag. He was going to leave the next morning because of a family emergency of his own, and then he was going to take his findings straight to the state medical board and the governor's office. But Thorne was already working against him. Harrison was getting ready for bed when someone knocked on his door. 2 orderlies told him that Dr. Thorne needed to see him right away about a patient who was in trouble. Harrison was suspicious, but he couldn't say no without showing his worries. He didn't follow them to a patient ward. Instead, he went to Thorne's private office. Thorne's office was a reflection of his personality. It was very tidy, sparsely decorated, and had walls full of medical books and journals. There was one oil painting behind his desk. It was a Renaissance anatomical study of a flayed figure with muscles and nerves showing. Electric lamps lit the room, which was unusual for the time, and showed that Ravenwood had a lot of money. The medical director sat quietly behind his desk with a glass of amber liquid in his hand. There was another glass, poured but not touched. "William," Thorne said with practiced warmth, "I think we should talk about your concerns directly, as a matter of professional courtesy between colleagues." According to Harrison's last journal entry, which he wrote hours later, Thorne knew everything. Harrison's nighttime explorations, his documentation, and even his conversations with patient 47. He talked about his work without getting angry or defensive, saying that it was a necessary step forward for psychiatric medicine. "He told me, All medical progress requires sacrifice. The patients here were already lost to society. Through them, we developed treatments that will benefit thousands. Thorne talked about his vision for a new way of dealing with mental illness, one that would not just treat symptoms, but change the way people think. He didn't call his work an experiment. He called it pioneering treatment. He compared himself to early surgeons who were first criticized for cutting into living bodies, but later hailed as medical heroes. Think about what we're doing here, Thorne said, according to Harrison's story. Patients who come in violent, self-destructive, or completely disconnected from reality leave as functional members of society. Their disruptive memories and behaviors are cut out and replaced with patterns that promote peaceful living. Is this not the ultimate humanitarian goal? To end suffering by taking away the ability to suffer? Thorne gave Harrison a choice. Either work with him on research and have access to resources that no one else has ever had, or be professionally discredited by carefully made-up evidence of wrongdoing, which could even lead to Harrison being committed himself. Thorne summed it up by saying, "Your reputation versus scientific progress. I'm giving you the chance of a lifetime." Harrison said no to the untouched drink because he thought it might have one of Thorne's chemicals in it. He said he was tired and asked for time to think about Thorne's offer. The medical director agreed, but Harrison pointed out that the orderlies were still outside his door, not to protect him, but to make sure he stayed inside. This last journal entry ends with, "I have no illusions about my situation. By morning, either I will have escaped with evidence, or I will become another of Ravenwood's secrets. I've hidden this journal where I hope a future investigator might find it. If you're reading these words, know that what happens at Ravenwood isn't isolated. It represents a dangerous philosophy taking root in psychiatric care across the nation. The patients here are not the only victims. They are the warning. There is still disagreement about what happened next. According to the official record doctor, William Harrison had a nervous breakdown during his inspection, which caused him to become delusional and make false accusations against the well-respected Dr. Thorne. Harrison was quietly taken to a private facility in upstate New York, where he is said to have died in early 1904 from complications of mental exhaustion. People thought his inspection reports were not trustworthy, so they were sealed. There is, however, a strange contradiction in newspaper archives from November 1903. The Pittsburgh Gazette said that there was a fire at Ravenwood Asylum on November 1st. The damage was small and quickly put out, and no one was hurt. However, records of the county fire department's response show a bigger event, with several fire trucks sent and several injuries reported. The most important thing is that Ravenwood's insurance claims specifically mentioned a lot of damage to the administrative wing, including Dr. Thorne's office and the guest quarters, which is exactly where Harrison's evidence would have been kept. Residents who were interviewed decades later remembered a night of strange events, carriages coming and going at strange times, and lights visible throughout the building until dawn. In 1903, an old man who had worked as a stable hand on a nearby farm as a teenager said he saw people being moved at night. Some were carried on stretchers, while others walked in straight lines like soldiers. All of them were loaded into covered wagons that went to the train station. After that, Ravenwood kept running, but with more oversight. In December 1903, Dr. Thorne stepped down from his job because he was worried about his health. He moved to Vienna, where he worked at a private clinic on his research until he died in 1917. His published works from this time make vague references to methods he developed while working in the U.S., but they have been changed a lot to hide where they came from and what they are. In September 1904, the asylum closed for good after a state investigation was started by anonymous letters sent to several newspaper editors in Pennsylvania. These letters, which were written by different people but had the same content, talked about Ravenwood's horrible behavior and violations of human dignity. The patients were moved to different places, the records were sealed, and the building was left empty. Interestingly, records show that in the months after Ravenwood closed, a number of other psychiatric facilities in the Northeast started using new treatment methods that were very similar to the improved versions of Thorne's methods. They were shown as new ways to deal with severe mental illness, but no one said where they came from. Several doctors who had written to Thorne went on to have successful careers, but their ties to Ravenwood are carefully hidden in their professional biographies. The real story of Ravenwood stayed hidden for decades. Then, in 1961, a junior clerk found a bunch of papers that didn't match the official story while doing a routine transfer of old medical records to the state archives. She found copies of Harrison's original documents, which had somehow been kept safe and hidden in boring administrative files. These papers led to a small investigation, but by then most of the witnesses had died and the physical evidence had been destroyed. Margaret Wires, the clerk, later said that a few files went missing from the archive soon after she found them. When she told her bosses about this, they told her that the missing papers had been moved to a secure facility with limited access for security reasons. Wires was moved to a different department soon after and told not to talk about what she had found. Workers found a sealed metal box inside a wall cavity near what had been Harrison's guest quarters in 1962 when they were looking at the eastern part of the abandoned asylum to see if it could be torn down. Inside was the journal that this story is based on, as well as several photographic plates showing the state of the sub-basement and samples of what later analysis showed were Thorne's experimental compounds. The discovery sparked a short-lived interest in the Ravenwood case. A writer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette tried to write a series about the asylum's history, using some of the newly found materials as a starting point. After the first article came out, the next ones were suddenly canceled. The reporter was moved to cover sports, and a retraction was published saying that the claims were not backed up and that the reporter relied on unreliable historical sources. The most troubling thing was found in 1968, when they were digging up the old asylum grounds to make room for a new housing development. Workers found a mass grave with the bodies of at least 42 people, many of whom had signs of surgery that matched what Harrison said about Thorne's experiments. There was no cemetery or burial ground at that place, according to county records. The project was quietly dropped, the hole was filled in, and the land was set aside as a nature preserve, which means it can't be developed again. Before being buried in a common grave at a nearby cemetery, forensic analysis of the remains showed some disturbing things. A lot of skulls had signs of trepanation and other brain surgeries. Some had metal plates or devices attached to the inside of their skulls, which was not a common medical practice in the early 1900s. There were small glass vials found in the brain cavities of 6 people that had traces of unknown chemicals in them that broke down before a full analysis could be done. This was the most disturbing part. The question is still how much the medical community knew about what Ravenwood was really doing. Letters found in Thorne's preserved papers show that some important co-workers thought that his methods, while maybe extreme, were not completely outside of acceptable experimental limits. Several well-known doctors who saw patients who had been moved from Ravenwood never questioned the drastic changes in their personalities. Instead, they praised the successful treatment of cases that had been difficult to treat before. A historian studying the history of mental health care found that many of the standard treatments used in the middle of the 20th century are very similar to Thorne's modified techniques, especially those that use both chemical and psychological conditioning. Modern psychiatry has long since stopped using these kinds of methods, but they were still used in institutions until the 1952. They never found Nurse Eleanor Sullivan. There is no record of her in any of the nursing registries in Pennsylvania from that time. Some people think she was one of Thorne's lies to see how discreet Harrison was. Some people think she was real, but was quieted down before Harrison's last fight with Thorne. A third theory, based on documents found in 1967, says that a woman who looked like Sullivan was sent to a Maryland asylum in December 1903 because she thought she was having hysterical delusions about medical malpractice. There are reports that she died there in 1907. Some things point to Sullivan having a more complicated role than first thought. Harrison's journals say that she gave her junior nurse specific information about laboratory protocols that would have been hard for her to get. Some historians have suggested that she may have been a former patient who underwent partial cognitive reconstruction, utilized by Thorne to identify staff with ethical concerns, subsequently facing her own moral crisis as memories began to reemerge. Harrison first learned about the terrible things happening in the sub-basement from the Morse code messages sent by patient 47, Her identity is still a mystery. It was impossible to say for sure that any of the remains found in 1968 belonged to her. The only hint comes from a single entry in Thorne's private research notes that says, "Remarkably resilient female subject," demonstrating unusual cognitive preservation despite extensive cerebral modification. The entry ends with, "Subject terminated due to persistent communication attempts. Brain preserved for further study." But there was a strange footnote in a 1955 psychiatric journal. A woman was brought to a hospital in Philadelphia in 1904 who couldn't remember her name or history, but could transcribe complicated texts in Morse code by tapping her fingers. This was one of many cases of patients who developed amazing cognitive abilities after brain trauma. The article said that she mostly communicated through writing. She had broken memories of a place below where minds were unmade. Hospital records show that she was watched for several months before a family member came to get her, and she disappeared from recorded history. Today, the ruins of Ravenwood Asylum are partially overgrown by the wilds of Pennsylvania. The State Historical Preservation Office has turned down requests to make it a historical site several times, saying it doesn't have enough historical significance. People in the area stay away because they say the air is heavy with the knowledge of what people did to other people inside those walls, not because of ghosts or other supernatural things. People who go onto the property say they feel a deep sense of unease, not the cheap thrill of ghost stories, but a deeper discomfort from standing where systematic cruelty was done in the name of medical progress. The main building's shell is still mostly intact, and its dark windows look like empty eye sockets looking out at the forest around it. Nature slowly takes it back, with ivy climbing the walls, trees growing through parts of the roof that have fallen down, and animals making homes in empty wards. It wasn't ghosts or demons that scared people the most about Ravenwood. It was in the planned cruelty that was called medical progress, the systematic removal of people who were thought to be useless, and the willingness of institutions to ignore uncomfortable truths. One of the most troubling things is how many of Thorne's methods were quietly adopted into mainstream psychiatry in different ways during the early 1900s. The medical records from different hospitals in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland from the 1,910 seconds and 1,920 seconds show treatment plans that are very similar to Thorne's cognitive restructuring methods. The language was cleaned up, and the most extreme parts were taken out, but the main idea stayed the same, using both chemical and psychological methods to break down bad mental patterns and then rebuilding thought processes that were thought to be better. These modified techniques completely lost any recognition of where they came from. Thorne's name seldom appears in psychiatric literature post-1910, notwithstanding his earlier prominence. His later papers, which were published in little-known European journals, didn't get much attention in the United States. It was as if the medical community had all agreed to use his methods while erasing the person who came up with them from history. Documents that were made public in the 1,960 seconds show that some government agencies were interested in Thorne's work during both World Wars. Memoranda talked about possible uses for behavioral modification techniques that were created in psychiatric settings for the purpose of gathering intelligence. It is hard to ignore the conceptual link between Ravenwood and later controversial government programs, even though there is no clear link between the two. Dr. Thomas Weldon, a junior doctor who worked for Thorne for a short time in early 1903, was the last known person to be connected to the Ravenwood case. In 1965, a medical historian interviewed the elderly Weldon, who gave perhaps the most chilling view. What happened at Ravenwood wasn't an aberration. It was simply too honest, too visible. Thorne's mistake wasn't his methods. It was his failure to maintain the comforting illusion that medicine never sacrifices individuals for progress. Harrison didn't expose a monster. He exposed a mirror that reflected what we all preferred not to see. Weldon talked about a medical culture that tacitly approved of experimenting on people who were already lost, like the severely mentally ill, the poor, and those without families to speak up for them. Weldon said, Thorne's mistake was writing it down. He kept detailed records because he truly believed he was doing groundbreaking work that would one day be recognized. Others were more careful. doing similar work but making sure they could deny it. Weldon says he left Ravenwood after seeing a procedure where a patient was given both electrical stimulation of the brain and chemical sedation at the same time, which caused permanent cognitive impairment. When I said I was worried, Thorne told me that the knowledge gained was more important than the individual outcomes. That's when I really understood what was going on. Weldon quit psychiatry completely after leaving Ravenwood and became a general practitioner in rural Ohio. He said he wrote letters to medical officials about the state of the asylum, but never heard back. I eventually convinced myself that I had exaggerated what I saw, he said. It was easier than living with the knowledge that I had been complicit, even for a short time. In 1969, a court ordered that all remaining Ravenwood records be sealed. This was done after a group of well-known medical families with ties to the asylum's operation asked for it. They are still not available today because they are kept in a climate-controlled building in Harrisburg. The court's decision says that they will stay sealed until 2029, which is 125 years after Ravenwood closed for good. The sealing order itself has some worrying language, saying that it was necessary to protect the reputations of distinguished medical practitioners whose experimental approaches, while perhaps unconventional by modern standards, were conducted in good faith according to the scientific understanding of their era. This change in how Thorne's work is seen, from being unethical to just being unusual, shows how people still don't want to fully admit what happened. A small group of historians and researchers is still putting together the Ravenwood story, using bits of evidence that were not hidden by institutions. Their research shows that Thorne's methods are similar to those used in later psychiatric practices that had an impact on how mental illness was treated in North America and Europe. Dr. Catherine Mercer of Columbia University is one researcher who has found similarities between Thorne's methods and treatments used in different institutional settings as late as the 1,950 seconds. She wrote in a 2002 paper, "The terminology evolved, but the fundamental approach remained, breaking down identity through combined physical and psychological stress, then reconstructing compliant personalities through reinforcement techniques. What started as experimental therapy at places like Ravenwood became standard treatment, with its origins carefully hidden." Established medical historians strongly opposed Mercer's research, calling any links between Thorne's work and later psychiatric practices speculative and sensationalistic. Several academic journals refused to publish her results because they were worried about the methods she used. The medical establishment's unwillingness to admit these historical ties shows that it is still uncomfortable with this part of its past. The walls of Ravenwood are still there, and as the sun sets over western Pennsylvania, their shadows grow longer. They don't have the voices of the people who suffered inside them anymore, but something about that suffering seems to have seeped into the building itself. It's not supernatural energy, but a real reminder of how cruel people can be when they pretend to care. It's a reminder that the scariest monsters have always looked like people, had respected credentials, and said their actions were necessary for the greater good. There is no doubt that the abandoned asylum has become the subject of local legends. Teenagers sometimes go onto the property as a dare and say they hear whispers or see lights in the empty windows. Paranormal investigators have searched the property many times and recorded what they think are signs of supernatural activity. These stories don't get it at all. They turn real historical horrors into comfortable fiction by replacing the documented atrocities with ghost stories that are easier to ignore. The real legacy of Ravenwood isn't the supposed ghosts, but the philosophical questions it brings up about medical ethics, institutional power, and how willing society is to ignore uncomfortable truths. The most troubling thing about the Ravenwood case, according to one historian, isn't what happened inside those walls, but how well the medical establishment dealt with and covered up the scandal, taking in useful lessons, while ignoring the moral issues it brought up. If you're driving along Route 30 west of Pittsburgh, you might be able to see the asylum's last tower through the trees. Most people who pass by don't see or know what it is. Maybe that's what Thorne wanted. For people to forget about his work, and for time and deliberate concealment to hide his methods. Ravenwood is not a haunted relic, but a warning about what happens when we give people who see vulnerable people as means rather than ends complete control over them. As long as the story is told and the evidence is kept safe, it will stay that way. The most credible reports indicate that a minor fire occurred in the administrative wing on the night Harrison confronted Thorne. Whether it was done on purpose or out of struggle, it made enough confusion for something unexpected to happen. A few patients from the regular wards were moved to the grounds for a short time. And in the middle of all that, some records went missing. They weren't destroyed. They were just taken away. Some people think that Harrison was able to give his papers to someone else, maybe one of the staff members he thought could help him. Some people think of a more interesting possibility, that patient 47 somehow got away during the chaos with proof of what had been done to her and others. Fire department records show that the fire started near the lab areas, which could mean that someone set it on purpose to destroy evidence. 3 firefighters said that the evacuated patients were acting strangely. They said that many of them were standing in formation instead of spreading out like they should have been, even though it was an emergency. One firefighter said that the patients moved in time with each other, as if they were following instructions that they couldn't see. After the fire, Ravenwood was looked at by people outside for a short time. For a short time, insurance investigators, county officials, and medical board members all came to the facility. But within weeks, the story had been well controlled. Official reports said that a small incident happened, was quickly dealt with, and had no effect on patient care or safety. People who saw more disturbing things were systematically discredited or silenced. An article in the Pittsburgh Tribune on the 8th of November 1903 talked about how some patients went missing during the fire evacuation without any explanation. The Tribune never followed up on this one article, and on November 12th, they published a retraction that said, "Reportorial error and misunderstanding of asylum procedures." By the end of the month, the journalist who wrote the original piece was no longer working for the newspaper. No matter what the truth is, there is still enough evidence left over to eventually reveal at least some of Ravenwood's dark past. It wasn't enough to punish the people who were responsible. Too much time had gone by, and too many powerful reputations were on the line, but it was enough to make sure the story didn't go away completely. What happened to Dr. Harrison himself is still one of the most hotly debated parts of the Ravenwood case. The official record says that he went to a private hospital in New York for nervous exhaustion and died there in early 1904. But, despite many searches by later investigators, no death certificate has ever been found. There is no grave with his name on it in any cemetery in the area where he is said to have died. In the 1970 seconds, a researcher found a doctor who fit Harrison's description working under a different name in a small town in western Canada from 1905 to 1937. This led to a more interesting theory. This doctor was known for being open-minded about mental health care and for speaking out for patients' rights. There is circumstantial evidence that this could have been Harrison living under a false name, but there has never been any solid proof. In the years after Harrison went missing, some of his co-workers in Philadelphia said they got letters from people they didn't know. These letters had no return address but showed medical knowledge and points of view that were similar to Harrison's. These letters often included harsh criticisms of psychiatric practices at well-known institutions, which suggested that someone who had left the field was still watching it closely. Today, Ravenwood is sometimes brought up in talks about medical ethics or studies of how psychiatric care has changed over time. The asylum is a stark reminder of a time when people thought that science without morals was not only okay, but also necessary for progress. The real horror of it isn't how strange it was, but how typical it might have been of the attitudes and behaviors that were common in a system that put results ahead of people. The most disturbing thing about the Ravenwood case is that we may never know how bad it really was, how many lives were ruined behind those walls, how many families got false reports about loved ones who had become unwitting research subjects, and how many medical careers were built on techniques that were refined through suffering that was deliberately inflicted and carefully documented. Helen Crawford wrote a memoir in 1958 called Fragments of Memory. It was about her time as a patient in different psychiatric hospitals in the early 1900s. Even though she never directly named Ravenwood, Her descriptions of a place in western Pennsylvania where patients were put through treatments meant to unmake the mind are very similar to what we now know happened there. Crawford said that the procedures she went through left her with big memory gaps and a constant fear of medical professionals. At the time it came out, the memoir didn't get much attention. Reviewers said it was too exaggerated or sensationalistic. Crawford passed away in 1961, coinciding with the initial discoveries of sealed records. Further study of her writing in relation to the new evidence suggests that she may have been one of the few people who survived Thorne's experiments and was able to tell her story, even if it was only partially. Crawford wrote, "They took pieces of us away, memories, emotions, the very essence of who we were. Some never came back from that empty place. Those of us who did return came back incomplete, haunted by the sense of something missing that we couldn't name. The cruelest part was that no one believed us. Our very trauma made us unreliable witnesses to what had been done to us. The sounds that used to fill those hallways are now gone. The records are still locked up. The graves, both those that have been found and those that haven't, keep their secrets. But as long as the story is told, even in whispers and with missing details, Ravenwood serves its final purpose. It is a warning from history about the evil that can grow when power is not held accountable, when weak people are seen as less than human, and when we choose to ignore the truth because it is uncomfortable. Archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have found more unmarked burial sites on the old asylum grounds in the last few years. This suggests that the 42 bodies found in 1968 were only a small part of the people who never left Ravenwood. County records don't show any paperwork for these burials, no death certificates that match the time frame they probably happened in, and no official recognition of their existence. A small memorial put up by a local historical society in 2001 is close to the entrance to what is now known as the Westmoreland Nature Preserve. The simple inscription says, "In memory of those who entered Ravenwood Asylum between 1887 and 1904, whose names and stories were taken from them. May their suffering not be forgotten." Every year, on November 1st, a small group of local residents and medical ethics advocates place candles at the site as a simple way to remember those who were systematically erased. As mental health care changes, the memory of places like Ravenwood serves as a reminder of where institutional psychiatry went wrong and what happens when patients become subjects, when treatment becomes experimentation, and when healing becomes control. People who work in these fields today don't see these historical cases as interesting stories. They see them as important warnings about the duty that comes with having power over people who are weak. Maybe the last word should go to an unnamed patient whose words were kept in Harrison's journals. They wrote a short message on the wall of one of the sub-basement cells that Harrison found during his nighttime explorations. "I was someone before I came here. Remember that. We were all someone before we came here." The walls of Ravenwood Asylum still tell their secrets to those who are willing to listen.